Hey everybody, it's your boy. I am not the only person in this sphere of political YouTube to have noticed a growing skepticism in regards to the United States, be it cultural, political, sociological, etc. In particular, this skepticism, which I will tentatively label Americoscepticism, has been on the rise in more British circles over the past decades, but in particular the past few years in online political circles. In fact, it's becoming so common that even leftists share this Americoscepticism, albeit for different reasons than right-wing Britons have. Nonetheless, it is growing, and like any kind of opinion, it's on a spectrum. From those who simply want nothing to do with the US apart from trade, to straight up anti-American sentiment. I cannot speak for anybody else in the world, but I can certainly try and discuss why British people may feel increasingly sceptical about America. I myself have long been an Americo-skeptic, even when I was left-wing, but this video is not going to be a criticism of American politics or culture. This is purely about why people like myself happen to be skeptical about America, and in particular, American power. So, for my largely American audience, do not take this as an insult. It's not that video. It's explaining to you why relations between the two peoples are not quite what you envision them to, and why many Brits simply want nothing to do with your country. I am simply relating reasons why people are sceptical of your power. I think to explain British Americoscepticism, obviously we have to go back in time to explain the history of the two nations, because our paths were once the same, and then of course were broken, but frequently intertwined over the centuries. It all has its origins in the Revolutionary War, the split of the two most influential Anglophone countries. It was here where the roots of the issues the British and Americans have with each other began, though it's not an event that the average Brit thinks of much. Americans are the ones who obviously are more interested in it. Then, in the 19th century, the two countries were rivals when it came to colonialisation, empire and geopolitical issues. Though it wasn't all bad, Americans would often marry into British and other European noble families, and there was probably more that the elites of each country had in common than they had differences. Then, in the 20th century, the biggest events that shaped our relations were the two world wars, the second especially. These were wars where not only did it show that the two countries could set aside their differences, for the most part, and work together, but it also showed that as a result of these events, just how much had changed between the two, and not all of it for the better. Britain had declined after being the world hegemon for the better part of 150 years. America had grown in the ascendancy, especially on the ashes of the British Empire after World War II, which meant the dynamic between the two countries changed, from largely distant and distrustful to Britain essentially becoming the lackey of the Americans for the next 80 years. The victory of the World Wars also had an effect on the national rivalries, with the two countries' citizens often getting into arguments over each other's war contributions. Though not something argued by veterans, but non-veterans, civvies basically. Americans, in British eyes, often appear incredibly arrogant when in every conversation a lot of them will insult and downplay the British contribution, taunts of "we came in to save you" and other such jibes. Not that we Brits don't banter back. Those comments are not something that we like, considering the damage the war did to our country, not to mention the damage it did to the Russians or to the French, something the Americans were lucky enough to avoid apart from some failed Japanese and German attempts, and Pearl Harbor. The Cold War, in the meanwhile, basically developed the Batman and Robin relationship to its full form. Aside from the Vietnam War, more on that later, Britain essentially followed whatever the Americans were doing. Meanwhile, the Americans did not bother to reciprocate these feelings of loyalty much, most infamously not helping Britain during the Falklands War, invading Grenada without our blessing, and also stopping the Suez Crisis, but expecting our help in most conflicts and issues. More on those conflicts later, which for the most part British governments would do. Then, throughout the 90s and 2000s, we would help the United States in its many wars and issues throughout the world, especially in the Middle East, sending troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. This is essentially the history of the two countries. So now with the history out of the way, which in itself is a reason for this phenomenon, what are the other main causes of Americoscepticism in the British? Well, one cause is the cultural differences between the two nations. Unlike what a lot of American conservatives and a lot of normies and leftists too believe, most British people do not believe that we are cousins. You often see from Americans, particularly American conservatives, the idea that the two peoples are cousins, as if because we share some cultural traits and values, that the bond that we shared from the very first colonies is still there. But to most Britons, that is not the case at all, especially to those of us who are Americo-skeptics. When the Revolutionary War happened, that was it. The bond was broken, that was that. We may have similarities, but unlike the Canadians, Australians and New Zealanders, hell, even the whole Commonwealth, they are seen as far closer to us as cousins as any American ever could be. Aside from those like T.S. Eliot who became British, they are the exceptions. So there is already a disconnect between the way the two countries tend to view each other as peoples. Another problem is the arrogance that many Brits complain about when talking to Americans, which I alluded to earlier, which I am sure some Americans could easily level at Britain. To many Brits who espouse this Americoscepticism, this is more of a pet peeve, but it can get so grating that they feel unable to work with Americans on political and cultural issues. Some feel that it's just the outcome of a country that is famous for the confidence that many of its people have and express, whereas Brits tend to be a bit more low-key and modest. But that it often degenerates into arrogance when certain Americans start to boast and bloviate about how better their country is and how bad Britain is and how lost we are, despite the fact that they ignore the very big issues that America has that are often worse than a lot of Britain's issues. Other Britons find it to be distasteful and find it funny that they boast about their history and exceptionalism, yet as many non-Americans say, they have no real history to speak of. Despite being world hegemon, despite having, on paper, the freest society, they act as if they simultaneously have a superiority complex and an inferiority complex, as if all the boasting is to compensate for the lack of history they have and the problems that are going on in their country. History, and some people would say culture, is something which Asians and Europeans have in spades. It comes from an empty place to these Brits, so the perceived arrogance of Americans is one issue, but it can be regarded as a pet peeve. Not everybody shares this. American cultural influence is fast becoming a contentious issue amongst Americo-skeptics, especially as the culture war developed and has waged on. Complaints of Americanization have long emanated from skeptics, whether left or right, whether it is the confluence of American goods and companies over British, American fashion, ways of living, music even, and especially language, more on that later. To many Americo-skeptics, especially on the right, Americanization is amongst the biggest cultural issues that come from America. Whilst it's very nice that the country on paper at least stands for the classical liberal values that Britain also, on paper, stands for, and that is to be applauded. And there are many things, like their right to bear arms, that should be imitated. There is, however, a lot that should not. It can be anything from adopting American speech patterns and slang, especially in more urban areas in the country, which are annoying and are signs of cultural erasure, but not as bad as other things. The worst that I have seen British right-wingers complain about is the importation of American Marxist ideology into British society. What the right in Britain have rightly called out, to the point that even mainstream commentators like Ed West have begun to discuss it openly in the media, not just my fellow colleagues in the British political sphere like Sargon of Akkad or Harry Angladive or any of the other British dissident voices. What we see is intersectionalism, something that has its origins in the American university system, infecting itself in the British education system, and sifting throughout society. Now, American nationalists like Louis Levi can scream till his face goes blue that Marxism, socialism, etc. is a foreign ideology, and that might on some level be true, but intersectionalism and the brand of identity politics and worldview being exported not just to Britain but to mainland Europe and the Commonwealth countries is American as apple pie. All its ideological creators, from Gloria Steinem to Angela Davis and Bell Hooks, all American intellectuals and ideologues. Sure, postmodernism was largely invented in France and Germany, with some notable individuals in the UK and other countries, including America. And cultural Marxism, as we know, was invented largely in Frankfurt, Germany. But this strand of Marxism is uniquely American, and their worldview is uniquely American. The idea of this blacks versus whites worldview, that everything has to be categorised in this way, the one-drop rule, segregation, the original sin of slavery, and the idea of institutional racism and other such nonsense is all American imports. To most British Americo-skeptics, and I would say British people in general, all of this is alien to us. Sure, our country engaged in the slave trade, but on British, and particularly English soil, there had been no slavery since William the Conqueror outlawed it for unknown reasons during his reign in the 1000s. And then of course, as a world hegemon in the 19th century, we not only outlawed it in the Empire, where it was allowed to exist for hundreds of years, but all over the world, and pursued an anti-slavery crusade with absolute zeal and passion, to the extent that we only just repaid the debts 100 years later, last decade. Britain does not have an equivalent to Jim Crow. Sure, we have had and do have racism in this country. We've had ethnic issues, but it's different, and it's not the same as American history. Indeed, during World War II, when black GIs were suffering racial discrimination to the extent there was open conflict between the whites and blacks in the army when they were stationed here, the British people did not back the racist whites. They backed the black GIs and indeed criticised the racism of the American military establishment. When the Americans tried to enforce their culture onto us, normal British citizens had the courage to reject it, and to even get up in the faces of the white soldiers and defend the black soldiers. It was something that was completely alien and anathema to not only our culture, but our worldview. This was something that was even noticed by the Americans and had to be included in their wartime training propaganda.
Well, goodbye, ma'am.
Goodbye. It's been very nice meeting you both.
Glad to have met you, I'm sure.
Funny you should come from Birmingham, too, isn't it? Have you come to my Birmingham, you must come to my home and have a cup of tea with me. Both of you.
Thank you, we will.
Goodbye and good luck.
Goodbye. Bye-bye. Well, where you going?
Well, I think I'll get some cigarettes.
I'm short, too.
Well, I'll get some.
Good. Now, look, men, you heard that conversation. That's not unusual here. It's the sort of thing that happens quite a lot. Now, let's be frank about it. There are colored soldiers as well as white here, and there are less social restrictions in this country. Just what you heard, an English woman asking a colored boy to tea. She was polite about it, and he was polite about it. Now, look, that might not happen at home, but the point is, we're not at home. And the point is, too, if we bring a lot of prejudices here, what are we going to do about them? Well,
The rejection of this American worldview goes as far back as the 1860s, when in Manchester and possibly other places in Britain, the world leader in cotton industry at the time organised a mass boycott of Confederate-made cotton, enduring a cotton famine as a result. Sure, the more rational thing would have been to continue buying southern cotton, but we Mancunians, as Brits, were anti-slavery. The people of Manchester at the time were still heavily influenced by the Enlightenment of the 1700s and the liberal policies of Gladstone, and especially Richard Cobden. We even sent President Lincoln a letter of support, and a statue of him was erected in his honour. Regardless of your views on Lincoln, it's the views of the British that matter more in this example. Unfortunately, however, we are now losing. Leftist activists for the last 40 to 50 years have systematically taken over the education system, as well as taking it upon themselves to be voices of minorities, or BAME people. BAME is a rather ambiguous and clunky term that stands for Black and Minority Ethnic. Yes, our acronyms are so bad that the word "and" is included in it. It's our version of the various American acronyms like BIPOC that you often see in America. It's so bad that even one of the importers of the American race-baiting ideology, David Lammy, rejects it, as have a lot of leftists, and unfortunately not enough right-wingers in recent weeks. This was an attempt to create an American racial categorisation system in the British mould. But it goes further. Not being able to find any historical instances of minorities being held back in British society, the left has, in their attempt to create their own Jim Crow foundational myth that the American left created, have tried to do the same thing in the minority communities across the country, often using the same old tactics that race baiters have used in America for decades, using slavery, prejudice, segregation, which never existed but they will try nonetheless, institutional racism, and police brutality. It doesn't matter that the police in Britain are traditionally unarmed and hardly ever shoot people, they will still try to drum up racial tensions, most notably in 2011 when an actual resisting drug dealer was shot by police, which resulted in at first blacks rioting in Tottenham and other areas of London, to then strangely becoming a riot of the white underclass, the latter being something that was technically separate and only happened because the riots in London were so bad, police from other major cities in England were weakened to help the capital. It doesn't matter that that is a rarity, it doesn't matter that crime statistics or the fact that the police recently even took a knee and found it easier to attack even middle-class white women. The police just hate the minorities, because they apparently do in America and did in the 50s and 60s over here, therefore they have to in Britain in the modern era. It doesn't matter that segregation was never a thing, and institutional racism was never a thing in British society. They have magically found evidence of the latter, and are trying to create the former over here. When a government report found that there was no institutional racism in Britain, the left had to ignore the evidence and create their own report to create the false reality. However, their tactics have been working, though there is increasing pushback. A lot of British people, not just minorities, fell for the Black Lives Matter myth, especially post-George Floyd, and a lot of minority youths have been taken advantage of by leftist activists because of real prejudice that their parents and grandparents faced in the 50s to about the 80s at the hands of a minority of racists. And it must be said, actual racist cops. They try to say that nothing has changed, that the police hate them, that white people hate them and want them gone. They are trying to artificially create an African American style community within the UK, despite the fact that the so-called black community in Britain is not made up of one culture or ethnicities, but hundreds. There are many different Caribbean peoples, not all of whom are black, and the same can be said for Africans and Pacific Islanders. Nonetheless, the attempt has been made and has been largely successful. British society has not been more divided racially for as long as I can remember. It was hardly an issue when I grew up, and now it is, because of leftist activism. A corollary to all this American-style racial activism is the importation of American-style politics, at least in regards to elections and presidents and prime ministers and things like that. Now, not only do we now have election debates in this country, but our people even follow American politics as if they were American citizens. Nothing could have been more bizarre than seeing British people protest Trump, not only once when he was elected, but twice when he came over to visit. There was so much anti-Trump propaganda mixed in with anti-Tory propaganda that you'd think I was living in Manchester, New Hampshire, not Manchester, United Kingdom. It doesn't just happen here. It happens even on the continent. It never happened when Bush got elected. It never happened when Reagan got elected. Even though Obama was seen as this historic event, no one acted like he was a British politician. But Trump, for some reason, was seen that way. Americanization has become so pervasive that British leftists, and even right-wingers it must be said, have become swallowed by American political culture. Trump is not our president. He's not even British. Sure, his foreign policy might affect us, but his domestic policy does not. It is a foreign nation, not a county down the motorway. Americoskeptics have also grown sick and tired of so-called British patriots using American political definitions and knowingly doing it. For example, using liberal and liberalism as a synonym or outright replacement for socialism or socialist. How many times must it be drilled into their heads, they say? Liberalism is not socialism. Socialism is not liberalism. Liberalism is John Locke. Socialism is Karl Marx. We have also seen an American-style Supreme Court tacked onto our political system by Blair. It has proven to be largely useless, occasionally almost downright dangerous. It almost ended Brexit, for example. But on the plus side, it did prevent Jemima Begum from entering the UK. But it's just another example of undue American influence and bad Blairite policy at that. British people speak in an almost American vernacular. I've lost count on how many people I've met who are British but speak like Americans, from the slang they use to the actual pronunciation. Their accents are hardly British. I can forgive a non-native speaker, they need someone to learn from, but not a British speaker. And it's this changing of the language, often intentionally done by Americanized British Marxists, that has been one of the driving forces behind their identity politics charge. But what do leftist Americoskeptics hate about Americanization? From what I have seen, it's mainly to do with American foreign policy and hegemony, something that is now being shared with British right-wingers also increasingly. British leftists are often anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, and anti-interventionist when it comes to foreign wars, to such an extent that an actual anti-British politician, Jeremy Corbyn, was their figurehead for years. But it makes sense. They don't like being entangled in what they see as the big capitalist imperialist Satan that seems to support everything they hate in the world. Everything that is the root cause of all the problems in the world. War in Iraq is the biggest contention for them, as well as British right-wingers. It conflicts with their pacifist views, whilst for right-wingers it's against the tradition of splendid isolation. And all this can neatly transition into a talk about the elephant in the room, the so-called special relationship. The special relationship has a long and complicated history, but the foundation of it was in the World Wars. It has its political element, but also its cultural element. For the Americans, the politics will always be America first, no matter if it's Republican or Democrat. But in terms of culture, they may believe themselves superior, despite paradoxically also having an inferiority complex in regards to history and maybe culture. They still see some weird connection to us, which, as I mentioned before, we Brits often do not share. According to some Americoskeptics, it is a myth that the current world order is an Anglo-American order. It is purely an American one. There has only ever been the Pax Britannica and an attempt at the Pax Americana. The Americans are the ones who dictate to us, the Brits, what the alliance's policy will be, what NATO will do, etc. The British can only offer an opinion. We cannot go about getting in the way of America. Like the aforementioned Suez Crisis, the Americans invaded a Commonwealth country, Grenada, in 1983. Incidentally, I share a familial connection with the island via my cousin. This was in order to prevent another Cuba as a socialist government had taken power. Reagan neglected to inform us that the invasion was taking place. The only thing Thatcher could do was acquiesce because the invasion was already in full flow, and almost at an end, but not before scolding Reagan on the phone, rightfully, for what he did. It's not just the fact it happens to be some small country in the Caribbean. As I mentioned, it's a Commonwealth member, and the Queen was, and is, still the head of state. We should have been the ones to do that if Thatcher decided it had to be done. We have not just military means, but political means also. It didn't help that it came a year after the Falklands War, a war, according to Americoskeptics, in which our so-called bestest allies in the world, our special cousins, failed to help us. Reagan suddenly became a paragon of fence-sitting alt-centrism, as Britain had to largely fight the conflict alone. Sure, we had some help. Chile did an enormous solid by distracting Argentina, but America did pretty much nothing. Meanwhile, Britain has helped America out in most conflicts that America has asked us to help them with. Vietnam was the exception, but unlike America, Britain at least had some understandable reasons. We were already overstretched. 50,000 British troops were with Malaysia in Indonesia fighting the communist insurrection, and in the late 60s and early 70s, the Northern Irish Troubles started. We were also bound by the 1954 Geneva Agreement, which ended the previous war between the Vietnamese and the French. Also, Wilson couldn't get backing not only from the public, but Parliament also. As for Reagan, sure, Argentina was an ally in the region, one of many juntas and dictatorships that America had supported for years. But when they attacked without provocation the so-called special ally, he refused to come to Britain's aid, playing the fence-sitter. There were really no excuses, no diplomatic issues or Cold War rhetoric, which could excuse his cuckoldry. It is this treatment that has left a bitter taste in the mouth of not just many British people, but especially Americo-skeptical British people. And the subsequent Middle Eastern warmongering of Blair and Bush also made the taste even worse. Hundreds of British and thousands of American lives wasted, lies, and American elites' greed. There just doesn't seem to be anything that benefits Britain politically or culturally in this so-called special relationship to the left and the right wing, Americo-skeptics. Americans can go on about military protection, but considering Britain is a net contributor to NATO, a nuclear power, and still, despite diminished capacity, capable of projecting force, we don't need America's protection. And we do not need American Middle Eastern oil or cultural exports. It seems that whenever America calls, we beckon, and it always ends up in ruin. It ends up with people losing their lives over nothing but America's imperialist agenda. Sure, we were an imperial power, but at least we actually improved the colonies, the Americo-skeptics will argue. Iraq and Afghanistan are bombed out husks of nations that were better off with the dictators than so-called Western or American-style democracy and quote-unquote freedom. If we want to be a good example and give them a taste of it, 20 years of poverty and sectarian conflict is not how to give these people freedom. In the end, British civilians and European civilians would be the overwhelming victims of the Islamic terrorism in the West, thanks to the American interventionist policies. Sure, it's geography that is the main reason, and America did have terrorist attacks subsequent to 9/11, but who started the war in Iraq? Who created the conditions for ISIS? Not the British, who are just the lapdogs who follow, but America. That is what a lot of Americo-skeptics believe, as do some Americans also. Ultimately, it is what it is. This strain of thought is only going to grow stronger as the years go on, and I predict that in a decade or two, this will become not just a policy for future right-wing and left-wing parties, but also become a mass movement in the UK. There will be pushback against Americanization, and the scepticism of the special relationship will eventually become calls for full-blown rejection and the full embrace of the Commonwealth. In particular, a lot of Americo-skeptic Brits advocate for CANZUK, a quasi-union of Britain, Australia, Canada and New Zealand as a sort of economic and cultural bloc against the EU and America. Some would prefer just closer ties to the Commonwealth and a small minority a return to empire. Most, I would hazard a guess, would simply prefer Britain to be economically and culturally dominant like, say, Japan or Germany are, but with our capacity for greater military power fully realised. This would mean that we would become a first-rate economy with a strong military, in particular the Navy and Air Force. We will see people in the country push back against the Americanization of politics and the importation of intersectionalism. We will see people attempt to reclaim the British vernacular from its increasing Americanization, as well as an attempt to rediscover British traditions and reject American imported ones. It will have its left-wing counterpart also, but in what way that will take shape, I am not sure. But in this case, I welcome their attempts to reject it also, as these people do exist. I hope this has explained Americoscepticism to my mainly American audience, and I hope you guys don't take it too personally. If you're in the same position, you would act the same as Americoskeptics do. Maybe I will do a video on what I actually believe when it comes to this topic, but right now I just want to explain it in general terms. But before I go, just one more brief discussion. Although Americoskeptics want out of the special relationship and the rejection of most things, if not all things American, that does not mean that they are stupid or blind. We all understand that in the battle for superpower status and world hegemony, China is the worst candidate for it. India, despite the connections, in my personal opinion, is nowhere near ready to lead the world. There are far too many issues in their society anyway. Out of the two evils, the overwhelmingly easier evil is the Americans. Because for whatever mistakes your country has made, it pales in comparison to the crimes of China, and before them, the Soviet Union. We have seen firsthand only what they did to our brethren in Hong Kong, something I cannot forgive the British government for not organising enough resistance to, more than the Americans. We've seen their economic colonisation of our cities. We would prefer America over China any day. Although idealistically and dreamlike it may be, many of us would prefer Britain to be the world hegemon. But that's never going to happen ever again. We won't ever be insignificant, but world hegemon? No. But nonetheless, America has an ally in the Americoskeptics against the CCP. I would not even say it's an enemy of my enemy is my friend. More, we can deal with an annoying acquaintance, which is better than dealing with a schoolyard bully. But anyway, this script is nearly 5,000 words long. Definitely my longest one for sure. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, I'll see you all later.